Before we start the analysis, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about the dangers of expectation and the importance of keeping an open mind. But before I can do any of that, I have to tell you a much smaller story about a day in the wild with Aloy. It was a perfect day. I had just finished taking out a camp of bandits, and I wanted to progress the story a bit more. For me, I was in a sort of open world heaven. I didn't feel overwhelmed. As Aloy, I felt natural bouncing from bush to bush, effortlessly manipulating mechanical animals to either do my bidding or never realize I existed in the first place. I wasn't an unstoppable machine-killing machine. I was a ghost. After a brief hunting break from the story, my focus picks up a signal in the distance. As I sprint across the desert, I see it. It's nothing I haven't encountered before, of course, but I see a glint hawk circling the sky in the distance. I remember from my journal that glint hawks tend to act similar to vultures. For me, I knew that where there were glint hawks, there was probably more robotic nightmares waiting for me. I approached the edge of the desert cliff to see a tall neck. It's easy, I thought. Nothing I haven't done before. Just gotta find a way to hop on its neck so I can scale it. As I walk forward, however, I realize that may be easier said than done. The only way on top of its neck is to leap off an island completely surrounded by snapmaws. They're one of the most frustrating aquatic beasts in the game. Across the island are some watchers, easy to take out, sure, but also quick to spot me. The glint hawk next to me takes off and goes around the island, looking for potential meals. Its purpose is to scavenge destroyed machines, but they weren't created without defense. These flying monstrosities will rain frozen bombs on you the second they spot a potential danger. Lucky for me, my hair is almost indistinguishable from the fire-red plants I'm crouched in. I'm safe as long as I stay here. I didn't come this deep into the desert to be safe, however. As the tall neck approaches me, I know that it's time to get a move on. The benefit that comes with scaling and overriding a tall neck is worth the struggle it will be to do exactly that. So I begin. I sprint from hideout to hideout, only to be spotted immediately. It was never going to be easy, I thought, as I narrowly dodged another frozen bomb. What more can I do? I'm already in so deep. I'm low on arrows, low on medicine. My only option is to do what I do best. Ghost. My second mistake, of course, was entering the snapmaw's home. So far I've managed to piss off both sea and air. I thought, can't get much worse from here. Far too frantic to aim carefully, I realized after a couple missed arrows that fighting back is not my best course of action. I notice a perch overhanging one of the islands that looks high enough to launch myself onto the tall neck. I missed it. I thought there has to be another place to hop on it. I start frantically looking around. The snapmaw tail to the gut does nothing for my problem-solving ability, so I decide the next island has to be good for me. At this point, I am completely out of medicinal berries. I have one health potion left. I've never been here before. I don't have even close to enough arrows to take on all of the mechanized monsters behind me. This isn't a world I can fight my way out of. I wasn't prepared. I could have been a better huntress. To the next island I go. I was able to lose my pursuers long enough for me to find an opportunity to scale my objective. If Aloy's hands were half as sweaty as mine, she would have slipped right off one of the conveniently placed handholds leading up to the tall neck's head. With the tribally revered sun lighting my way, I was able to make it to the top and override the tall neck, taking control. The game prompts me to rappel down so I can reap the rewards of my perilous conquest. Not yet, I thought. I'm not really ready to go yet. I just want to look. With my eyes, not through the map. Not for too long, of course. There were too many things to do. I rappel down, and my map is illuminated for me. Yeah, that was essentially just a Ubisoft tower. Yes, the idea was derivative, but the execution of it was tremendous. This game was probably my biggest surprise of 2017. Normally, you'd hear that said before someone starts gushing about the game, but I have a secret. I have never been more surprised to dislike a game. My experience with Guerrilla Games' 2017 release Horizon Zero Dawn wasn't really like a sandwich. It was like a Big Mac. Don't Big Macs have the bread in the middle? I don't know. It was far too layered to be a sandwich. At first, I was completely turned off to the game. I was blown away at how something so uninspired could have received the critical success I saw the game receive. I mean, we'll go in depth with this, but I was not feeling too happy with my purchase. If you know me, you know I'm not a video game critic. I'm a nerd who likes to talk about books and themes, but decided to gush about my favorite video games on YouTube too. Thinking this could be absolutely one of my favorite video games, I was excited to play this to the eventual Platinum Trophy, which I actually did achieve. I stuck around though. I learned the mechanics. I was able to wield Aloy more competently, and she began to wield her weapons more expertly. I got a hold of the concepts and the ideas. I felt motivated. I felt like I had a lot to discover in the world. Then it happened again. The repetition of open world games began to wear me down, and the game's flaws began to emerge. There's actually a lot wrong with this game. So much so that I'm actually willing to say that little of it is really Horizon's fault. Instead, it's more symptomatic of a massive pattern shadowing open world games. A pattern of ubiquity and a lack of inspiration. Of a fetishization with cinema and a massive issue with pacing. Now that being said, it's bizarre to me how this game was universally loved and makes a lot of game websites Game of the Year watch lists. Maybe it has to do with the release date. It came out early in the year and crucially right before another big-time open world game, Breath of the Wild. Maybe, however, I'm just missing the point. I'm willing to admit that. I hope to explore all of this and more as we go through and try and parse out where this game succeeds and fails. Per usual, timestamps are in the description below, and I think a lot of this video will be more easily digested in chunks. I know it seems long, but there's a lot to talk about here, especially involving the game's gameplay. Horizon Zero Dawn was released in February of 2017 by the same developers who created the first-person shooter franchise Killzone. It accompanies a long list of cinematic, sort of realistic PS4 exclusives brought to Sony's console war leading console. The easiest way to classify this game is as a third-person action RPG. Now there are a lot of different gameplay systems at play here, but generally this can also be classified as a pretty but unoriginal open-world game. The game famously came out a couple of weeks before The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which brought into question a lot of the standard foundations of what makes an open world game an open world game. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the most damning elements of Horizon's experience. It just isn't doing much new. Sure, the game stands upon those old foundations of open world traditions well, but it only does exactly that. It just stands still. I think it's going to be remembered as one of the last old open world games. Now we're going to cover all of this. I think it's only necessary we familiarize ourselves with the story of the game first so that we can get a good understanding of the theme. If you're new to the channel, I'm usually much more concerned with the thematic readings of the game rather than just the story elements or just the gameplay. Instead, I want to look at how the two pillars of the game, its story and its gameplay, come together to create a piece of media that makes you feel a certain way. For all intents and purposes, this is a video game book club. Quite a pretentious one at that, but whatever. We're going to gloss over the story, but the real meat here is the philosophical and literary elements of the game and its rhetoric. There are plenty of great summary/analysis videos on this game, including one by Chris Davis that you should absolutely check out if you're more interested in a detailed examination of the plot. Timestamps in the description if you've played the game and want to hop right to the discussions of philosophy, theme, and character. Let's do it. Horizon Zero Dawn takes place far into the future, but you wouldn't really guess it if you just looked at the cultures and the landscape. The story takes place on Earth, but again, it appears to be completely different. The skeletons of buildings and cityscapes stand only slightly taller than the skeletons of those deranged robotic machines that roam the Earth now. No structure that we know to live on Earth still exists. That includes physical structures, of course, but also the structures of culture. The governments, religions, or factions of old are buried underneath. It's as if humanity hit the reset button. Those machines I mentioned earlier are now the new royalty of the land. For some, they peacefully roam the land, looking to do the job they were created for, which doesn't have to be killing. For others, however, they are naturally murderous, equipped with jaws or rockets in order to destroy whatever it needs to. Now you see, this was the case until a machine plague called the derangement, which caused the machines to become immediately aggressive towards humans. Even worse, new and more dangerous machines have begun to appear, spawned from the mechanical wombs of whatever metallic monstrosity that lurks around. You see, the game takes place on Earth, sort of, but it's hardly an Earth that you would recognize. Roaming the ground are foxes and bunnies and turkeys, hunting and grazing the landscape in baffling harmony with their robotic doppelgangers. The humans in this world have rebuilt from whatever has brought them to this stage. In Horizon, there are three main factions of humans that inhabit this large area. Although they have been warring on and off for a long time, I found it really refreshing and interesting that for the most part the game takes place in a time of relative peace between the factions. Tensions are high, but the actual three main factions themselves are working on repairing their relationships. So often in games, they go with this idea of factions fighting and warring each other, each with these really polar and identifiable philosophies and iconography. There's always the war faction, always the science faction, and always the spiritual faction. It's essentially an evolution of a very Tolkienistic approach to culture. With most of the fictional worlds with their own warring governments, you can almost always distill them down into dwarves, humans, elves, and scary evil dudes in Fireland. Game designers have them fighting each other because it either gives a motivation for the player to participate in combat, or it allows for some of meta gameplay where you get to make decisions for a faction. The reason I think what Horizon is doing is refreshing is that you come after the main civil conflict. You are there to see an attempted rebirth of the relationship between the Nora, the Karja, and the Oseram. Now yes, there are remnants of the previous Karja rule that act as a main antagonist, but the three tribes themselves are in relative harmony. Enough of setting. Let's meet our protagonist and vessel for ourselves, Aloy. Let it be known that this is not a complete summary, and so I will most certainly gloss over a lot of the story, especially the side content. You don't care that much, and I have more respect for your time than that. This is there so that there's a context for everything else I talk about in the game. The game's story can best be summed up as a Bildungsroman. That absurdly pretentious term is one used to describe a coming-of-age story, or more particularly a story about someone's spiritual or moral education, whether that is them becoming closer to the metaphysical or falling away from it. The story follows Aloy from infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood. You see, Aloy doesn't really fit in. It's not that she does it on purpose, but she was born to a mother who no longer exists and was outcasted immediately as a result of this. When Aloy was born, she was placed outside a giant mechanical door, which was known by the Nora as the home of the All-Mother. Two of the three matriarchs of the Nora saw this as a curse and outcasted her to the hands of another outcast, Rost. Rost teaches Aloy a lot as she grows up, and he ends up developing paternal feelings for her over the years. One day while she's picking berries for the tribe, Aloy gets ridiculed for being an outcast. In a fit of anger, she runs away only to fall into a cavernous hole. In this hole, she finds a small triangle-shaped device that's she just kind of knows to put in her ear. I don't know. These caves are filled to the brim with technology. Not primitive technology, but luminescent scientific technology that we today would consider futuristic. Rost finds her, and she eventually goes through what is a tutorial section in order to introduce the player to the stealth mechanics of the game, as well as the bow combat. After saving a boy that was pinned down and hiding from the mechanical beasts, she begs to Rost to explain why it is she's an outcast. Rost crucially tells Aloy that outcasts have an opportunity to join the tribe in a series of challenges called the Proving. If Aloy can participate and win in the Proving, she will be made a member of the Nora, and more importantly, give her the opportunity to ask the matriarchs about her mother. This becomes the main motivation for Aloy growing up. From 6 to adulthood, Aloy trains herself to become the most gifted huntress she can be. There's actually a really great montage sequence here that got me pretty excited for the game. Go ahead and watch. I mean, as far as video game introductions go, this one is pretty good. It's a contrived tutorial sequence, but I found the young Aloy sequences kind of cool. I love the way she approached the environment. It's little touches like this that make me say, okay, this is a next generation video game. It's not just the graphics or the environments themselves. Take a look at how she climbs stairs, or how her eyes wander from things to thing as her childish hyperactivity prohibits her from, well, focusing. That was a pun. The triangle she found is called a focus. Okay, the game sort of opens up a bit here and allows you to do some side quests. You help Ross take down a sawtooth, which is a big machine that has been terrorizing the countryside. With that being your biggest test, Rost understands that Aloy is finally ready to take on the Proving. After walking to the settlement where the tournament will be taking place, Rost says his final goodbyes to Aloy. You see, the thing is, non-outcast Noras aren't allowed to talk to outcasts. Rost, knowing that Aloy will become a Nora, also knows that she will never be able to talk to him again. They've developed this deep connection over the years, so obviously Aloy protests. It's clear to me, and others I'm sure, that Rost has a ticking timer over his head at this point, a Damocles sword that is slowly inching towards his heart. As you enter the city, you meet two influential people for the rest of your journey. You meet Erend, a mustache-wielding vanguard of the Oseram tribe, as well as Olin, another Oseram who curiously has his own focus on his ear. Aloy begins the Proving alongside some of the bullies and friends she's made when she was 6. The game throws some different challenges at you, as well as some platforming. It turns out you win the Proving. Woo. During the ceremony, Aloy receives an arrow to the shoulder. An ambush begins, and you are forced to fight off a group of human raiders to save the day. You begin to turn the tide of the combat, and you end up coming across the bandit leader. After defeating the cultist leader, she notices that he too has a focus on his ear. After the confrontation, Aloy is lifted over the edge of the mountain by an even bigger and even scarier cultist leader. Out of absolutely nowhere, and to no surprise at all, Ross saves the day and hits the big guy with an arrow right after the cultist slits Aloy's throat with a knife. And of course, as a surprise to no one, this happens.
Burn it all, then to your task. As you command.
What happened at the Proving is then known as the Proving Massacre, as your friends and many others were struck down by these unknown bandits. The game opens up at this point. What was a reasonably linear experience now morphs into a traditional open world experience. This means that your ability to traverse the story is relatively up to you. That is to say that if you wanted to, you just could do side quests or just do main story content. I know it sucks to hear this, but we will get into the detail into the gameplay section. Just before you set out, though, you do some scanning of a focus that you found. You are shown the command that was given to the enemies that tried to kill you at the Proving. You also see footage of another woman, one that apparently is a 99.47% genetic match to Aloy. You revisit the door that you were found next to as a child, and you are told that you were born to no mother, but instead of the mountain itself. The door recognizes you as the older woman, but won't let you in because Alpha Registry is corrupted. The door will not open unless you are able to cleanse the corruption. Aloy thinks that now her best option is to go talk to the guy with the focus from before. This is really the first act of the game in completion. It succeeds in doing everything a first act should, especially in a video game, as the Proving acts as a relatively solid narrative/gameplay excuse for a tutorial. As far as the pacing goes, this is how the game sets itself up for you. The player. Your main motivation at this point is to learn who your mother is, and how it is that you came to be found outside the All-Mother Temple. In addition to this, across the course of the story, you will also help with an overarching plot of a rebellion organization called the Shadow Karja that are trying to reclaim the throne of the Karja. These usurpers are remnants of a mad king who almost destroyed a lot of the civility amongst the 3 clans. While the tensions are still palpable between each of the groups, they are all relatively united against the Shadow Karja. So those 2 motivations are what sort of characterize the majority of the second act. You are uncovering secrets involving how the machines got here and why they are so angry, and you are trying to play a political assassin as well against the Shadow Karja. The reason I frame it this way is that I feel the second act was one of the best in terms of gameplay, but one of the worst in terms of story and pacing. You see, there's this humongous difference between video games and movies. Well, of course there are a lot of differences, but there's this one that stood out to me. That's length. For some reason, video games have this obsession with being a certain length. Games are advertised as having hundreds of hours of gameplay. At times, you often find story contrivances or extra things in order to artificially lengthen the game. I think Horizon is egregiously guilty of this, to the point that it obliterates common video game etiquette and replaces it with a canyon of vacuous filler. For example, there's a lot in video games that could be condensed to one mission, but is instead condensed to multiple missions, broken up in a way that you are doing the same thing over and over again. Let's go into detail. So this second act I keep referencing, right? It starts around the 10th main quest of Horizon Zero Dawn. It's titled The City of the Sun. It has you traversing a long journey to get to that Karja capital we mentioned earlier, called Meridian. Essentially, the quest can be broken up into travel, combat, detective work, then combat. In this quest, you're given essentially snippets that lead you to other snippets of story that lead you to other snippets. You find out that a previous character you met, Olin, the one with the focus, is in cahoots with the Shadow Karja. These rebels, they worship something called Hades, which speaks to them in demonic tones through their focuses. Foci? Anyway, they essentially are being ordered around by this painful-sounding demon mechanical thing. This is the tie that binds the two main stories together, being the Mother motivation and the Shadow Karja motivation. This also reveals that the reason the Shadow Karja attacked her at the Proving and elsewhere was because of her resemblance to an old-world scientist named Dr. Elizabeth Sobek. Even if you disregard the issue of player motivation versus Aloy helping out the Karja, which we will cover here in a second, even the storyline of Aloy finding out the secrets of the machines is far too stretched out. For example, starting from the 14th main quest on, you begin to slowly, and I mean slowly, piece together the secrets that surround the game's many mysteries. In this quest, you discover the remnants of an old world company called Faro Automated Solutions. In this old world building, you learn a couple of things. You learn that Dr. Sobek is about 900 years late to a meeting, and that the meeting was with the head of the automated machinery company, Ted Faro. Faro Automated Solutions are responsible for both the focus and the machines that lurk everywhere within the game. They're described by the company as machines of utility and peacekeeping, to ease the burden that falls on humans and instead index it out to specifically designed machines. What you eventually discover, however, is that the robots begin to glitch out, which these characters have begun to call the derangement. As if that wasn't bad enough, they also began to reproduce and replicate at enormous rates. An unstoppable rate, to be exact. Using biomass from the Earth, the robots are able to learn and gain intelligence at such a pace that the world would be stripped completely naked of any biological material within 15 years. And I guess a fit of human ignorance and lack of humility, Faro didn't create a kill switch for these mechanical monstrosities. Thus, Dr. Sobek desires to create a countermeasure in order to save not only humanity, but biological life on Earth. Now, the obvious thought here is that she obviously had to have succeeded, otherwise how does anything exist in the world? Now, here begins the way the game lengthens itself unnecessarily. Basically, in the subsequent quests, if you're not fighting the Shadow Karja, you are going to entirely different places thousands of meters across the world to do an entirely unoriginal quest to learn just a teensy bit more about the game's story. It reminds me a bit in this way of Wolfenstein: The New Order. If you've seen that video of mine, you would understand what I mean in regards to stories. Now, I don't have footage from this game anymore, so enjoy this random footage, but if you remember from that game, the sort of impetus on the player is to attack the stronghold of General Death's Head. Okay? In order to do so, then, you must get the nuclear launch codes on the moon. Well, in order to get to the nuclear launch codes, you have to first find the chief scientist and impersonate him. Well, in order to launch the nuclear bombs, you need a U-boat. In order to get a U-boat, you need to get a box that you can stow away in. In order to get the box, you need to steal helicopters. I know this was a bastardization of the story, but you understand what I mean. Each of these tasks that I just described was one mission. Each was another opportunity for the player to engage in the combat, and each time the combat becomes less fresh and more repetitive. If this were any other kind of medium, this would be narrative suicide. But because it's video games, it's okay because the games need to be a certain length. Look, Horizon has a lot of filler content. Video games by nature have a lot of filler content. But Horizon's main story content has filler content. To further exacerbate this issue, for the latter half of the game, you are bossed around by a mysterious man named Silence, who Aloy seems to have no issue following, despite her usual aversion to authority. I don't know. I guess it's because he promises her information about Aloy's mom, something she is desperate for. He takes you around and around the open world, discovering different Pharaoh Solutions offices and power plants, until you find out as close to as much as you can about what happened to the world before you were born. Enter then Project Zero Dawn, Dr. Sobek's grand idea to preserve and save humanity. This radical solution to an existential threat was so extraordinary and difficult that it required years of preparation involving the brightest scientific and cultural minds in the world. Essentially, Project Zero Dawn is an intercontinental global network of bunkers and terraforming facilities that were planted in order to regrow the Earth. It was like an embryo on a timer, intended to restart the biological processes that keep Earth going. In order to create an environment capable of sustaining life, there needed to be an artificial intelligence, one capable of overseeing all of the terraforming efforts. This AI in particular was named Gaia, whose main goal was to oversee 9 different sub-functions such as knowledge or detoxifying the atmosphere or the reintroduction of animal life. Gaia also created underground cauldrons, which act as a gameplay element that was created to build more machines that would counteract the glitched machines and help the terraforming process. Now, this is all important to know. Not only will it help our thematic reading of the game, but it will give some context as to why you are doing a lot of what you're doing in Horizon. Still, though, this doesn't really explain what happened to you or your mother. Sobek was supposed to be preserved in one of the vaults, but where is she? I guess we have to do another dungeon crawling mission in order to find out. The thing is, even after all of this, you're really not much closer to understanding anything. In fact, an enormous amount of ancillary questions are raised, exponentially stemming from the root problem, much like a horde of angry mechanical beasts. Because as Silence continues to enigmatically string you along, Aloy is becoming about as frustrated as I was with the lack of pace and focus the story was affording me. The 2 previous very lengthy and very similar missions could have easily been condensed into one, provided that they space out some of the information to give the player's brain a break. One of those issues is that of the general public. How did they react? How could they possibly be okay with only a select few beings being able to see the light of day ever again? Well, via some PR magic, many believe that Zero Dawn was a weapons project that was promised to obliterate the machines and save humanity. Using this as a uniting force, every able-bodied person was given a weapon and told to go out and fight against the hordes of mechanical evil. What they didn't know, of course, was that this was absolutely just in order to stall the exponentially growing forces of the machines. These people were intended to die. Every one of them. The scientists needed time to finish Project Zero Dawn, and the only way they knew how was to fool the people into holding off the machines until they could. It's a grim idea, really. For a T-rated game, I thought this was extraordinarily dark and adult idea to make such a main part of the game. Of course, they don't show any of it, but it's still a scary thought for me. It kind of makes me giggle thinking about how weird rating systems like that are. I mean, this is as an adult of an idea as possible. An existential threat stalled by sort of a self-genocide of billions of people. But because not a ton of blood comes out of your thousands of victims or there isn't a boob, the game gets a T rating. Okay, total sidetrack. And that's the thing. The next generation of humans would not be born. They all died fighting off the robots. Gaia contained billions of seeds and embryos capable of repopulating humanity, but none would be born of a human, including Aloy. You were not born of Elizabeth Sobek, exactly. You were born of a machine. Again, after learning all of this, the game sends you off to another remote part of the map for another information dump. In this one, you learn a bit more about the subsystems of Gaia, including Hades. Hades was there just in case Gaia created an ecosystem that malfunctioned or was unsustainable. If that was the case, Hades would destroy it all so Gaia could learn and try again. He would trigger Hephaestus, who would create more machines to destroy all organic life. Man, unfortunately for humanity, when you create militaristic and destructive artificial intelligence, stuff goes wrong. If we hadn't already figured that out from the original machines. This was a turning point for me in the story. Of course Hades gains relative sentience and begins to want to destroy things. I just don't understand this. Maybe it is some sort of commentary on the hubris of man. It seems like this whole thing was started by angry machines being made without failsafes. Why in the world Dr. Sobek thought Hades was a good idea is beyond me. It absolutely feels like a contrivance to not only have an antagonist, but a foil and mystery wrapped around Gaia. Gaia, knowing that Hades would destroy humanity regardless of the world's state, decides to find a way to explode both herself and Hades. On top of that, you learn that Ted Faro, the creator of the machines, actually destroyed the Apollo subsystem, which housed knowledge, in an attempt to prevent the humans from learning about their mistakes and repeating them. He also killed all of the alphas, or the people that were supposed to live until the new world. Your sort of mother, Dr. Sobek, also sacrificed herself in order to save a malfunctioning part of Gaia. As we near the game's climax, you essentially learn that your mysterious partner, Silence, was the one who awoke Hades after he was promised the knowledge of the Old Ones. Because the Shadow Carja were also worshipping Hades, Hades also convinced them to lay siege to Meridian so that they could access something called the Spire, a tower used to relay the orders from Gaia to all the subsystems. By taking control of the Spire, Hades could take over and destroy the world again, I guess. Aloy kicks ass and takes control of Hades. She acts as Elizabeth Sobek in the simulation and defeats Hades and I guess ends the machine threat because their derangement would be stifled. I mean, you can tell story isn't really my thing. The ending of the game gives you some resolution with your mom and then a pretty heavy-handed sequel bait. I was left with more questions than answers, I'm afraid. Who is Silence? Why does he look like he does? Why did Hades turn so evil? Why? I just don't understand the role of Hades. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It will be a hellscape no matter what. Why create Hades at all? Why not have Gaia be able to tell if she had messed up the atmosphere and fix it accordingly? You would think they would learn. They're fixing the problem of rogue artificial intelligence with more destructive artificial intelligence. In broad strokes, I think the easiest way for me to describe this story is that it was interesting, but far too stretched out and unfortunately fell victim to video game pacing. It's a premise that is based on flashbacks and passive listening to old people talk about something that happened years ago. The mysteries don't unfold in action, but instead through lost audio diaries and video recordings. Thus, it is a series of 3 or 4 massive info dumps that occur after scripted boss battles and high adrenaline sections. It can be so hard for a video game to maintain pacing when this is the structure because ultimately players will do lots of different activities between each of those info dumps. Again, I just can't help but feel that the story was something interesting on the surface but ultimately vacant of certain necessary aspects such as a villain, for example. There might be 3 you could say were villains, that is, the Shadow Carja leader, Hades, or Ted Faro. I am purposefully not Googling the Shadow Carja guy's name because that's how I remembered him. Weird looking evil dude. He had one dimension and that was angry. Hades' motivations were far too confusing for me to consider it a compelling threat against me. You never have enough of a grasp of what Hades is and how it manifests itself in order for it to be a villain that drives me to want to destroy it. Ted Faro, on the other hand, might be the most evil of any character in the game, but he doesn't actually exist to you. He is 900 years old. You only see him screwing things up in retrospect. He was a villain to Dr. Sobek, but not to Aloy. And this is a huge problem to me in terms of storytelling, especially one that requires so much violence. There should be a villain, and don't get me wrong, the game has a clear paradigm of bad versus good, and I think that is a result of not having a good villain. A good villain introduces moral complexity into the story, not moral paradigms. In that sense, I guess Silence is the moral floater, the undetermined on the bad versus good scale. Even then, he falls into just straight evilness towards the end of the game, again making it very clear who is in the wrong and who is in the right. As tradition says, I must place Aloy on the ludonarrative dissonance gauge. I definitely think we're nearing the red here. A good example of how this is a problem is in its writing. You know, all video games have this issue of the disconnect between the player and its character's motivation. What I don't get is when the dialogue actually brings attention to it. It's very bizarre to me, and I don't know how it doesn't raise alarms in the writing rooms. For example, when talking to the gate guard of Meridian, Aloy says things such as, "I don't have time for this," or once, "That's your war, not mine." It's especially bad in Meridian because you can immediately go straight to the Lodge, a hunting guild whose role in Aloy's story is almost non-existent. Helping the people in the Lodge can take upon hours of gameplay time, but there's really no connection between it and the two main motivations of Aloy, which are defeating the Shadow Carja and finding out about your mother. Yet she still seems entirely interested in joining and working with these drunkards. I think in a lot of cases, the writing doesn't really improve much here. The game is obviously dealing with extraordinary circumstances and absolutely dealing with heavy philosophical ideas. So I wonder a lot of the time why the writing chooses to be so surface level and bantery. I think there was a lot of opportunity here for Gaia and Aloy to really delve deep into some philosophy about, what it means to be a person, considering the fact Aloy was born of a machine. Sort of, I know. I'm certain that these topics are discussed more thoroughly in the audio logs and supplemental dialogue in the game, but what I desire is for the game to confidently embrace itself as a story of deep moral consequence, of powerful rhetoric. Instead, it regresses, most of the time, to surface-level Naughty Dog-esque banter. In that sense, I'm further confused. I'm further confused as not to what everyone else seems to like about this game, but instead what it is I am missing in my enjoyment, or lack thereof. Granted, this is only a fraction of the game, and we have much more to discuss. And for me, that's it for the story. I'm not a story analyst. I'm not going to take into account plot holes and story inconsistencies. People will sometimes comment on my videos saying that I'm a baby Joseph Anderson. But I'm not a fiction writer like he is, and I'm not marketing myself as one who would pick apart a story and its fallacies. I think it has more to do with the length. But the game is dealing with a lot of interesting ideas and premises, but they ultimately get buried beneath a number of limitations, most of which can be attributed to a close following of the preset lines that characterize most open-world games. In order to address a lot of those philosophies and greater moral challenges this game is intending to unpack, we first have to open up our understanding of Aloy and her castmates, both thematically and narratively. So we're going to go ahead and hop into the character and theme section of the video. We're going to talk about the philosophy and the theme behind all the stories, as well as its literary elements. So let's go. This is going to sound crazy, but Aloy kind of blew me away at first. I had one of those moments, like I mentioned before, that said whoa, okay, this feels next generation to me. So much of her character is communicated through her facial features and animations. It's insane. She has this spark, this unmistakable fire that makes her hair look tame. She really does want to search for knowledge. Her motivations were believable to me because she was believable to me. I think at times Ashley Birch did a fantastic job at voicing Aloy, and other times she felt underwhelming or out of context because of the writing being underwhelming or out of context. I mean, really, if you go back and watch my video on Grand Theft Auto 4, I speak a bit about believability in video games and how it's the stories and motivations that leave one feeling immersed in a game. Otherwise, how did we ever fall in love with the characters in Final Fantasy VII or the story of Metal Gear Solid 3? I feel like for the first time, I felt a little different about that, and it has everything to do with the eyes. They say the eyes are the window to the soul, yada yada. I get the feeling that for my time with Horizon, I felt that I was looking at the eyes of the characters far more than the subtitles. And I don't know about you guys, I really don't, but this was a first in video games for me. I normally find the lip syncing and the facial animations of characters so bad that I tend to sort of avert my eyes to the dialogue alone because I don't know if I feel like there's a true character talking to me. This should work as a framework for the rest of AAA video game developers who can afford to create such realistic aesthetics. Start from the eyes out. Bad stories will feel more digestible that way. In other senses, however, there was some things about her character I didn't like. Some of it doesn't have to do with her necessarily, but the way she is presented. As you can tell, I would pretty much never call myself a gaming critic, but man, do I have some pedantic critiques with some of the character design behind Aloy. The first thing has to do with the thing we just talked about, how realistic she looks. Most of the time, she is picture perfect. I mean, let's be real, she's actually like a total babe. She has like perfect eyebrows and cheekbones and teeth, and don't even get me started on the teeth. What I'm trying to say here is that with great graphical fidelity comes great responsibility. She is so beautifully portrayed that it sometimes undermines her character and the strife she has been subjected to. I think it's also important that we talk about this idea of Aloy as this badass female character. I generally think that term is sort of overused for any woman who performs any sort of violent or rebellious action, but in this sense, again, she is different. I don't know if I think that badass means strong. Aloy is strong, let's get that out of the way. She routinely manipulates and destroys people and objects 3 times her size. She is an athletic freak of nature, born and raised with the jungle floor callousing her feet and her bow strengthening her to the point of having little resistance. She's also badass insofar that her motivations make her badass. From a very young age, she told herself that she had one goal. She told Ross that nothing was going to stop her from learning about her mother. In order to do that, she must of course pass the proving. So what does she do? She becomes that athletic freak of nature and hardens her resolve to a degree that no obstacle can stop her from achieving her goals. I mean, that's pretty badass if you ask me. Furthermore, she acts as a total metaphor and boon for women overcoming culture and society. In that sense, she is this sort of quiet feminism, this paragon of strength and agency that says to women, disregard norms, become your true self. This is evidenced in the fact that she first disregards all Nora cultural norms placed on her as problems of tradition and older ways of thinking. Even when she discovers that she is essentially an instrument, a vessel meant to be manipulated, she disregards it to continue helping not only the Nora, but all the clans instead. No romantic interest either, which was a refreshing twist. Even further, she isn't bloodthirsty, she is curious. She isn't a pacifist, but her main interest is knowledge. In that sense, Silence is sort of a foil to Aloy. He wants knowledge for seemingly mysterious but almost undeniably selfish or malicious reasons. Aloy wants to know more about her mother for herself, sure, but more in an attempt to make sense of her place in the world and who it is she really aligns with. For Aloy, her quest for knowledge is impeding her ability to become who she wants to be. For Silence, his quest for knowledge is his attempt at becoming something he is not. This is reflected in his character design, of course, a bastardization of a man, a blurred line between the humans he lives alongside and the machines who hunt those humans down. Through this, of course, I think what this game truly excels at thematically is its ability to create a convincing expression of humanity in its purest form. Let me elaborate. The game is, in a way, a sort of Truman Show experience, maybe more like the TV show Lost. Okay, bear with me. I mean this is in the sense that it is almost this controlled experiment, this attempt to pit humans in a situational scientific control room to learn, is conflict human nature? What parts of being human is learned and what parts are innate to our being? The people living in this world essentially started from square one. They don't know the world that existed before them. They don't know of the politics or the culture that you and I know. They take no time to immerse themselves in tribalistic tendencies, and they are far from unselfish. People still want money. People still want to be in power. There's a real statement Guerrilla is making here by hitting the reset button on humanity. No matter what, people are going to fight each other and kill each other. And no matter what, there will be good people like Aloy and Rost and others. Past that, there's this underlying and all-encompassing feeling that there's this conflict between that of the mechanical and that of the natural, between the realist and the romantic, maybe even between a bit of the soul and the brain. I mentioned this a bit in regards to Silence, but in a lot of ways this is an extremely modernist look into what our relationship is to industry, to capital, and to that of the machine. I'm reminded of legendary modernist authors like T.S. Eliot and Tolkien. Both had such issue with the perverse and ever-present spawning of our mechanical tendencies, of our ability to become desperately tied to the routine of a machine that our lives have become. It's become reflective of the machines themselves. Eliot actually writes in his poem The Wasteland, "And each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street." Contextually, Eliot is talking about the ways in which humans have slowly transitioned to the same tribalistic marching of zombies, of cattle marching to and from work amongst the streets of cities characterized by industry. Note how he uses iambs here in his meter. It's encouraging listeners to think critically about how rhythmic these people's lives have become. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Does this repetition, this consistent meter, does it remind you of anything? Does it remind you of your own life or how you progress through an open world game? Notice how he uses the word flow. He obviously views technology and modernity as a pacifier of individuality. To Eliot and to many others, industry and modernity bring upon the arbiters of control. They represent the death of volition, the end of agency. I don't think Guerrilla is completely unaware of this idea. In fact, I think they are acutely aware of the commentary they are making, insofar that Ted Faro's plans and industries are so reminiscent of so many other great and powerful businessmen and manufacturers that, given 20 more years, could easily create something of an existential threat through the guise of technological progress, just like Ted. I mean, isn't Ted just the perfect sort of exaggeration of a guy like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs? I mean, even down to the 1 to 2 syllable names and the sleek suits and chiseled hair. These guys, like Elon, absolutely have the power and the resources to, given time, bring something to the world that could radically shape and or destroy the world as we know it. So often we view industry and robotics as a means to enhancing human quality of life, but how far is too far? When I talk about all these poets and literary terms, I'm speaking about this. I'm talking about the philosophical and cultural struggle that great minds have wrestled with between that of the machine and that of nature, and the ways in which our lives have begun to blur that line. You know, as an aside, I absolutely do not think that modernity is some plague eating away at our intellectual ability. In fact, I do believe that those who tend to think that are the same who tend to think, I don't know, Katy Perry is trash and would rather listen to Queen because they were just born in the wrong generation. That being said, I absolutely do believe that this dichotomy between the machine and the self is one that requires unpacking and thinking about, lest we polarize ourselves either way. There are two fundamentally different ways of ideologically viewing the world in conflict here. In that sense, it's kind of more like the Tolkien way of viewing things. Remember how I said there is little moral complexity in Horizon? The same can be applied to Tolkien's fantasy epic. There's a clear good and evil, bad guys and good guys. There's a clear paradigm of morality. Furthermore, Saruman and his legions of Uruk absolutely represent industrialism and modernity, especially in how they obliterate the forests surrounding Isengard. You can begin to see how I connected these two sort of texts of rhetoric when you compare how the machines literally consume biological material at a rate unstoppable by man. It's a pretty clear moral connection to ourselves today, consuming resources at an exponential rate through machines. It also further expands the paradigmatic chasm between the natural and the modern. It's through both of these views that we can begin to see the commentary the game is making on the ways in which technology influences our life. This is a game deeply concerned with both the environment and how we interact with said environment. And I'm not prepared to say that it's this climate change commentary because I think it's painting with a broader brush than that. I think it's more of like a hubris narrative, an examination that in the name of convenience, we will always sacrifice things. That if we have the resources, we should use them. Okay, I know that's a lot, but I feel like if you're to this point in the video, you're sort of on board with me here at looking a little deeper at stuff. As always, I like to say that I encourage criticism, even if you think it's mean. I think it'll probably be all right. I want to get better at this. That being said, I think there is some real tangible truth to these claims about theme. I'd love someday to sit down with one of the more conceptual developers and ask if these concepts are even considerations going into the creation of the game, or if they exist as a result of the stories that are spawned from the gameplay itself. To me, there's so much evidence that this thematic reading isn't just one of a pretentious video game analyst. For example, as much as there is this total representation of how modernism and technology can bring down the entire human race, so too is there a tremendous examination of spirituality and a cultish adoration of nature. The Nora are the foil to someone like Ted Faro because they are so far pushed against this idea of technology and modernism that they become just as dogmatic and routine. There are rules and regulations to their culture that are entirely arbitrary past these created spiritual justifications to the All-Mother. I mean, isn't this why Aloy is the main character? She is the perfect medium here, the equilibrium to all of the polarization between the two warring ideals of machine and nature. And it's important to remember here that Aloy is literally the product of a machine. She is born in a chamber of technology and spawned of an artificial womb. She's also raised of the Nora, of the nature lovers. She's also the killer of machines. She's also the tamer of machines. Aloy is the sense of the chaos, the peace, and the panic. It's through that lens you really start to see Aloy as an almost religious figure, a moral testament to what humans should be and how they should act. Courageous, stands up for herself, compassionate and driven. She was born of an unknown source and was relatively unknown until she is given supernatural powers. Powers we know comes from the Focus and her hereditary connection to Elizabeth Sobek, but powers nonetheless to everyone else. We later find out that the essential creator of the world as we know it, Elizabeth, is the one who created Aloy. I mean, in a lot of ways here, Aloy is Jesus. I guess that makes Elizabeth God? Or maybe Gaia is God. Reality is, Aloy is supposed to be the moral landmark we as players look to when we are understanding the conflict between the modern and the natural. I mean, in all of that, I really liked Aloy as a character. As far as the world that surrounds Aloy, there's a lot of rhetoric packed inside of the environment as well. I think Guerrilla might actually be paying attention to theme and motif more so than a lot of developers, which in my case goes a long way for me when reviewing a game. Take for example the sun. If you've played the game, you know that the sun is a heavily influential motif throughout the game. The Karja worship it, for example. As you're playing the game, you'll notice just how prevalent the sun actually is in your view. If it's dawn, the sun will pierce every blade of grass and will warm the sky with this deep red glow. As I was playing it, it actually started to make some serious sense to me that the Karja would worship the sun. You have to remember, the knowledge of the old ones is gone. If you lived in the desert area and looked up every day to see this magical glowing orb of power, you might feel a spiritual connection to it as well. Speaking of, I actually think the desert area is the best area in the game. It really is the entire second act of the game, and it's more of an unexplored aspect of video games than that of this frozen tundra Skyrim level. The platforming is fun, the aesthetic is gorgeous, and like I said earlier, it is by far the most holistic and thematically consistent area in the game. While you're playing, you really do start to feel you are a stranger in a foreign land, an outsider from the frozen tundra you're used to. All in all, I love how the landscape itself can serve as a vehicle for the ideas and themes the game is presenting. As always, we may or may not be in any more agreement on the literary merits of this game. That being said, though, there is undeniably a wealth of things to unpack from a story as narratively dark as this one. As we explore the gameplay a bit, we'll begin to see whether or not the story lifts up the gameplay or vice versa, or maybe neither at all. Thank you for listening to the theme. Let's go hunt some robo-dinosaurs. Okay, I want to get this out of the way now because it's necessary. This game felt finished. Wow, why is that so uncommon? Why is that such a tremendous feat in video game development? I started playing the game a couple months after launch, sure, but I swear that a lot of games in the same situation have such obvious development issues that could have been fixed had it been given more time. I am not exaggerating. Most critics say that some games feel half-baked. This game felt golden brown, a beautiful crust surrounding a warm center. Okay, it's okay. You can comment that was weird. I don't care. I stand by it. It's just the truth. As a general rule, I think that the gameplay in this game is pretty much its main draw for a lot of players. I won't get into the nitty-gritty because you have watched here and you understand that the game is about shooting your bow at robots. Of course, the game has a completely different approach to shooting your bow at robots, which is the real meat of the gameplay analysis here. Before we can get into that, of course, we have to talk about where the bow shooting fails miserably. It fails miserably with every enemy that is human. It's a travesty. Not only is the human AI atrociously bad, but they carry absolutely no extra weight to the combat and only serve as walking headshots. The hitboxes are buggy, the animations are buggy, the stealth around them is impossibly difficult, and the enemies as a compelling threat is also completely null. When approaching the humans, because you have the power of slowing down time, it devolves into jumping up and down in place and headshotting as many as you can. It's vomit-inducing. Okay, well, maybe not that, but it's boring, which just might be the cardinal sin of video game development. The main form of combat, though, occurs between Aloy and the machines. Let me explain, even though I'm sure it needs no explaining. In Horizon, each robot enemy has different components that can be targeted and knocked off. Most will just do extra damage when removed, but some will cause other effects, like the machine overheating or them losing attack moves. The key to successfully taking on enemies, especially on the hard difficulties, is to learn your opponent, then attack them with the specific element they are weak to, and then hit them in the specific places they are weak. What this allows is for a combat centered around preparation and precision, not necessarily damage per second. I like this. Dare I say I love it if we're being generous. On the harder difficulties, sometimes you will still get some of the bullet sponginess that you would expect from a less precision-based action game, but more or less you are being rewarded for accuracy and preparation. Occasionally you will find your arrows do this sort of, Angelina Jolie and Wanted thing where they will be flying straight, right? And then immediately correct itself toward a separate hitbox of the machine. This is, of course, the result of the enemies not consisting of just one hitbox, but instead multiple overlapping hitboxes in one small area. I imagine such a precise game requires such aim assist, otherwise it would be infuriating on console joysticks. Of course, this all contributes to a wider perspective of Aloy being this master huntress, which she honestly is. You're given traps, bombs, and tripwires all at your disposal to ambush and hunt these robots as if they were the animals of prey of the old world. It has to be recognized as one of the great achievements of this video game. Guerrilla managed to create a holistic combat system that encourages a specific feeling in the player, a feeling that you are a shadow huntress, a markswoman trained in the art of manipulating the landscape for your benefit. They're not trying to give you player choice in the sense that you can be a warrior or a mage or an archer. No, they're saying you are a huntress and you will hunt. It's confident and it's great. Of course, the kinetics of Aloy contribute to this. She handles sort of unrealistically, but effortlessly. She can turn on a dime and sprint indefinitely. She has absurdly competent jumping ability and can climb any surface that the developer says she can climb. There are actually a lot of surfaces that you think you should be able to scale, but are unable to because they are not marked with the white paint that identifies which ledges can be scaled and which cannot. I've heard this complaint a number of times, so I'll be quiet. Aloy's moveset consists of a lot of things. Her bow, a sniper bow, an elemental war bow, her spear, which has a light and heavy melee attack, a tripcaster, which shoots wires that do damage when broken, a bomb slinger, and I'm sure some others that I'm missing. There was like a shotgun too. Aloy can do a dodge roll, which you learn pretty early on that it might be the most OP move in the game. It took me about 5 hours of gameplay before I realized the best course of action is to roll towards the enemy like in Dark Souls rather than away. Most of the machines have these wide, cone-shaped attack hitboxes, so rolling into their attacks is actually more effective than rolling laterally. While her floaty kinetics leads towards the feeling of being a huntress, so too does your gameplay loop and the system surrounding said loop. In order to explain this, I can only do so logically, sort of. I think the main loop of Horizon goes as follows: preparation, knowledge, execution, looting. Now, I understand this is painting in broad strokes, but if you understand this, you understand a lot of the main loop of what you'll be doing in Horizon. A lot of the resources and damage dealers in Horizon are focused around items found scattered in the world. There are sticks, berries, flowers, and machine parts. You use these to create arrows and potions you use. It contributed to this feeling of self-worth and volition. You are crafting each arrow that you fire, which of course makes you want to take a little more time aiming your shot. The precision would not feel as necessary if you did not have to craft your own arrows. You might say, well, David, you can just buy your own arrows and equipment. Yeah, you can, but the currency of the game is called shards, which conveniently are also used to create arrows. They're the arrowheads. So even when you're buying ammunition, you're using ammunition. As an aside, I always felt weird buying arrows with shards because if you kind of think about the logistics of that, oh boy, I'm giving a man arrowheads for full arrows, which have arrowheads on them. So like how is that profitable for you? To keep going on the first stage of preparation, we also have to look at how Horizon handles health. As we know, how games handle health can easily make or break a title. Horizon does so interestingly. You can use traditional health potions that you craft from the wilderness, but you can also use berries you find in the wild as well. Now, I like the berry health because while it wasn't a lot of healing, it would always fill you up just as much as you needed and nothing more. It's sort of a quality of life improvement like this that can turn a good game into a great game. Say you have 375 out of 400 points of health. You can go straight to full health by just using the berries necessary for 25 health points. So you've crafted your arrows, your traps, and gathered enough health. The next thing you need is what every great huntress needs, knowledge. So you come over the hill and see a number of machines. What do you know about them? What equipment should you bring? By scanning your enemies with your focus, you can get a good idea as to what kind of elemental damage you need to deal based on the machine's weaknesses. After that, of course, you end up taking out the enemies in whatever way you see fit. shoot them a bunch. After you've created your own personal landfill, you will begin to scavenge that landfill and take whatever you need for your next foray through the gameplay loop. So when we're not talking about specific quests that have you doing specific things, this is generally what you'll be doing. On your open world checklist is also bandit camps that you know like from every Ubisoft game ever. There's these corrupted zones, which are just mini areas that house tougher versions of machines. There are the tall necks, which we talked about in the beginning, and your usual side quests in hub cities. There are the hunter challenges, which are time challenges that have you doing silly things like killing X amount of enemies in Y way. There are these sort of dungeon-esque areas that end up with you being able to control different types of machines in order for them to do your bidding. These were some of the most underwhelming parts of the games for me, just as an aside, and gave me some sort of Mass Effect Andromeda PTSD, if you remember the vaults in that game. It's in these dungeons that there are some basic platforming, some one-step problem solving, and an ending boss fight. It's a total snore, a total missed opportunity to encourage some brain using in an otherwise exclusively mechanical game. The world map is sort of deceptively small, as a lot of it is mountainous terrain that cannot be walked. There's a frozen tundra type area, a desert area, and then a very snowy mountain area. The desert area is sandwiched between the other two, so I won't try and explain the way that happens. Furthermore, once you enter the second half, there really isn't much reason to go back towards the Nora homeland again until the very end, making the map appear even smaller. I want to talk a little about the scaling in the game and why it insists so heavily on being an RPG where it really has no reason to be. Now, let me explain, because I know that sounds incendiary, but this was one of my least favorite parts about the game. Let's explain first with the skill tree. The skill tree is one of the most boring in any game I've played, and when it is interesting, all it does is gate certain moves and abilities until later into the game. Most is just damage increases or quality of life upgrades that should just be there to begin with. Even worse is the gear system in the game. The gear progression is horrendous. It isn't clearly communicated to you which stats are important and how good certain weapons and armor are. And furthermore, there's this, tiered loot system like Diablo or Borderlands, but it holds just no meaning. I was getting purple and blue gear very early on, and it wasn't noticeably different than the more common gear, just slightly higher numbers. I used the same weapons and armor for almost the entire final 2/3 of the game. Being on a hard difficulty, I think it was hard, I feel like this is an absolute failure of the loot system. I should be forced to adapt and progress. I think I wore 3 different armor sets for the entire 30 hours of playing the game. Now this is just an indictment of the loot tiers and variations of the same weapons, not necessarily an indictment of the variety of loot in general in the game. There's actually a lot of different types of damage dealers in the game, but there's just no need to have the tiered loot system. There's no reason to pretty much have any of the RPG elements in the game. The rarities, the skill trees, anything. It's superfluous and boring, which again just might be a video game cardinal sin. The scaling problems don't stop there. If you're like me and you like to, mow the map and complete a lot of the optional objectives as you go, then you'll notice that you level up far too fast for the game to scale with you. There was a time where I was doing main quests meant for level 16 players, and I was level 41. This kind of thing drives me crazy in a game, and I don't really have a good reason why. It continues to enforce the fact that this game has no business baking in these RPG elements. Baking in is wrong, they just put them on the top as an afterthought. The game performed really well. It runs at a consistent 30 FPS, and when it drops, it's because there's an absurd amount of visual detail going on screen. The loading times are horrendous, sometimes lasting minutes. It's longer than the opening of Game of Thrones, but I understand. To a degree, the game is doing the things that I have never seen done in a video game, visually, so it didn't really bother me a whole lot. There wasn't much texture pop in either, at least not noticeable to me. So generally, in broad strokes, I think that Horizon's gameplay is nothing to scoff at in terms of Game of the Year candidates. I just don't think it should be, but it makes sense that some would see just the gameplay as reason enough to consider this game great. Unfortunately, however, I think it just doesn't do enough differently to warrant being considered any different than your traditional open world game. Doing something everyone else does is a bit better is good, but it's not as good as doing something different well. And I guess as we sort of close out this analysis, isn't that really what we've learned? This game just isn't as special as I was led to believe. It's just, it's pretty good most of the time. I mean, it has some fatal flaws, but I guess I haven't played Breath of the Wild, but I imagine my analysis could have been a bit more effective had I. If you've played both, let me know your comparison. I hope Sony continues to throw money at these developers so they can take this idea and this character and make it into something truly special. For a first go, it's pretty good. It's something that could be incredible if given the passion and effort that it deserves. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game that you should know if you like it or not. If you like collectathons with a slightly better than usual story, you'll probably like this. If you take your RPG elements seriously, this game will drive you crazy. If you're in it for the eye candy, get this game. If you're in it for the innovation or a lot of variety in gameplay, maybe keep looking. If I had to condense it, Horizon is a good video game. And I hate being lukewarm like that as a game writer, but I'm serious. That's the barometer for this game. It's, good. Hope that was worth the hour. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this video and putting in so much time into my content. It's crazy to me that there's a market for this kind of thing on YouTube. It gives me a lot of joy, don't get me wrong. Please comment below or tweet at me saying that you made it this far into the video. Not only do I think you're awesome, but it gives me a good idea as to how people are responding to each video. As always, I like to get a little personal and talk about the state of the channel at the end of these videos. You might have noticed that this one took almost 2 months to create. At the time, I am a full-time student in university and kinda have 2 jobs. On top of that, I'm in school to become an educator, so I'm also observing and student teaching in a classroom every week. I don't say this to command any sympathy, but instead context. Unless these videos start to explode, I just can't be held to the same standards as other analysis YouTubers. I do try my best and will continue to do so. Hopefully the next one doesn't take this long. I only say this at the end here because I know that if you made it this far, you are somewhat interested in what I have to say. This video took 2 months to make. To me, that's inexcusable. Even after saying that, I can't promise the next video won't take 2 more months. Or 3. I'm juggling a lot of things. Speaking of the next one, who knows? I really don't. I know I want to cover Wolfenstein 2, but that doesn't come out till like October 27th or something. I would need to do something before that one. I'm thinking about a couple of videos, but I'll try to commit to one before the video is up. I just finished reading this book about video game development and philosophy. It's centered around Spec Ops: The Line. Put in the comments if you want me to make a video about that before Wolfenstein 2. I've considered sort of changing my approach a bit. For example, I want to maybe take a look at franchises a bit more because I think that would suit my video style. What I'll notice is that actually playing through the games isn't that much of the workflow. It's about 20%, I'd say. So, for example, I want to work on a franchise retrospective about Dark Cloud. I don't know if you guys have heard of that series, but it's on the PS2. So if you'd be interested in less me looking at one game, but is instead me looking at 2 or 3 games in a franchise, longer time between the videos, but the videos would obviously be longer, and you could sort of compare them as they go. You've probably seen videos like that. Let me know in the comments. Other than that, it would mean a lot to me if you subscribed and commented some criticism to make these videos better, or at least just something, hey, I like the video. Any kind of criticism is fine, even the mean kind. You won't hurt my feelings. This channel getting some traction would honestly blow me away. I smile so big just thinking about it, so I hope you do your part and share with someone. But that's enough of me selling out to you guys. Follow me on Twitter and like the video, yada yada. You guys are awesome. Have a wonderful night.